affected a few counties. So to get a sense of the problem, Prime Minister Robert Peel sent a scientific commission to get solid numbers. Wait, pause the history for just a second. The Prime Minister's name during the potato famine was Peel. No one else thinks that's a little funny? No, I know it's a serious story. Come on, stop looking at me like, fine, you know what, it's fine. I'm sorry. His name's Peel, though. Now, that commission was in the House of Commons, telling Parliament to expect 80% mortality in the potato crop. They devised methods for keeping the blight away from harvested potatoes, but these proved ineffective. The news troubled Peel. In the summer, there had been hints of crop loss, but that was nothing new. Irish potatoes were unreliable. There had been 16 potato failures since 1800, and when crops failed, tenants couldn't pay their rent. When tenants didn't pay, landlords brought police and troops to throw them off their land. That meant riots and retaliatory livestock trades. It would also mean secret societies like the Molly Maguires and White Boys ambushing landlords and middlemen in their carriages. And those previous potato losses were only regional. This was the whole island. Instability worried. A few weeks ago, Irish had sentenced by O'Connell's had attracted and the government had and the reporting was that now that it was November and the full harvests were coming in, the scope of the problem was becoming clear. Not even harvested potatoes were safe. In Western Ireland, a poor farmer had buried his harvested potatoes in a pit, muttering a prayer.
Police, put your hands up!
But a few days later, opened the pit to check them. Half were totally rotten. Panic struck the whole west of Ireland, where the climate was too wet for grain to grow.
Loser!
The frightful and popular law of the poor.
Surrender now!
Bountiful mercy, avert such a devastating threat. The field had his but in action was not one of them. The son of a textile industrialist, he was the first prime minister to come from business rather than the aristocracy. He risen through the civil service with sheer hard work and a few big gambles. And he was about to gamble again. Ireland would need food, but Peel would have to walk a fine line. He was a Tory, and his Conservative Party were hardcore trade protectionists, particularly due to support for grain producers. Whatever he did, it couldn't undercut or upset the grain producers. And then there was the opposition, the liberal Whigs. They were similarly hardcore when it came to free trade economics. They hated any government intervention in the market. So in other words, the Tories wouldn't support bringing in foreign grain because it would cut local merchants' profits, and the Whigs would shoot down any intervention on prices. Meanwhile, Daniel O'Connell and a Dublin group proposed their own measure. Forbid turning grain into whiskey, bring in foreign grain, institute public works, and stop exporting Irish grain, beef, and oats to England. Neither party, Peel knew, would stand for that. After all, grain imports were already essential, as the two parties consistently brawled over the Corn Law, a series of protectionist measures meant to keep cheap American grain out of the UK. Oh, by the way, in Britain, corn means grain. Got it? Cool. Peel had a plan to thread the needle, but it had to stay a secret. He sent an agent to Boston on a mission to buy £1,000 worth of maize or cornmeal. Peel's agents then started shipping it to Ireland on the quiet. His bet was this: since maize didn't grow in Britain and no British merchants traded in it, this wouldn't be a direct intervention in the market. But the shipments still had to be kept secret, or British merchants might freak out about the competition and withhold their shipments to Ireland. The plan wasn't to feed Ireland with cornmeal. It was that cheap cornmeal would keep food prices low. Maize would not be given away, but sold at cost to councils, and paid for by landlords who would fundraise through their own poor relief organizations. The government would then match those funds and deliver the cornmeal from regional food depots. Peel also instituted road building projects, where people could earn a wage to buy the corn. It would be revenue neutral. Ireland, he said, must feed Ireland. If that sounds like a convoluted bureaucratic nightmare to you, you are correct. The idea of fundraising wasn't particularly terrible. It meant that the poorest counties got less food aid than the richer ones. Parish priests complained that no one in their county had anything to donate. If they could, they would have already bought food. Irish farmers ended up pawning their few possessions to buy cornmeal. Others had no choice but to sign up for the hard labor of working on the road. There were logistical hurdles too. Irish infrastructure was dismal, with a minuscule railway network and roads that deteriorated outside major cities. Maize shipments had to navigate those rocky networks to reach rural areas. But even before that, the maize had to be ground into cornmeal, and Ireland only had 2 mills that could accomplish that. And even when people got the corn, they had to learn to cook it properly, or else it made them sick. Scurvy, previously unknown due to the potato's high vitamin C content, started cropping up. So people who couldn't get the relief food went hungry, and people who could plunged deeper into poverty, keeping themselves fed. Some even subsisted on spoiled potatoes. There were food riots and a few high-profile attacks on wealthy citizens. In one county, 1,500 Irish farmers turned up, all armed, when a group of British troops arrived to enforce an eviction. But overall, there was no major risings and no mass. People survived. Peel, however, would not, because his maize and work programs were not the end of his plan. Though a Tory, he'd come around to the free trade views of the liberal Whigs. He disliked the Corn Laws, which kept cheap American grain off the British market, artificially inflating bread prices, and saw in the Irish crisis an opportunity to push for repeal. Now, if it helped Ireland, so much the better. But that was secondary. He would use this famine as a cudgel to beat his opponents with. He took on the Corn Laws, decrying how high tariffs contributed to starvation in Ireland. And he argued that greed, as much as blight, was starving the Irish farmer. And this was explosive. In 1845, the Corn Laws conjured up the same emotional weight that surrounds issues like healthcare and fuel taxes today. Champions of the law predicted that repeal would collapse the agricultural sector, while the repeal camp cast images of a starving British public unable to afford bread. This move pushed Peel out as Prime Minister, but he was back 2 weeks later when the opposition failed to form a government. Long term, repealing the Corn Laws would prove good for Britain. Cheap food helped fuel the expansion of its industrial base and build its empire, but it did nothing to help Ireland. In fact, by tying famine relief to the Corn Laws, he'd thrown the Irish poor into a partisan lawsuit. Now, members of the pro-Corn Law camp doubted there even was a famine in Ireland. They spun a conspiracy theory that Peel had embellished reports of one in order to galvanize the repeal. And this theory gained credence when news emerged that the Scientific Commission overestimated the 1845 crop loss. They had predicted an 80% mortality for the potato, but actually, the figure ended up being about half of it. It was still a dire situation, sure, but not the agricultural apocalypse the scientists This ugly partisan warfare meant first, an entrenched bloc in Parliament now saw possibilities of a partisan war. And second, it created an impression that reports of crop loss in Ireland were always exaggerated. But the truth boiled down to this. In the future, families would die of empty bellies in Ireland, while in London, politicians would dismiss reports of famine as alarmist. On June 20, 1846, as his cornmeal deliveries were finally in full swing, he crossed the aisle and voted with the opposition, repealing the Corn Laws once and for all. But he got to enjoy his victory for less than 24 hours, because the next day, both parties revolted and threw him out of power. The Whigs took over, high on their victory. And Peel's relief program, which had let the Irish poor barely scrape by through the first year of the crisis, came under the full control of a civil servant named Sir Charles Trevelyan. His first act was to cancel the food shipments. After all, the task was done. Next year's crop was about to come in. But the 1846 crop was a total failure. And the bad times, the great hunger, were about to begin. July 1846. Ireland's early summer harvest is starting to come in. Reports of blight circulate, but in the east, summer has been tempered. The hunger might be over. Lightning rends the sky. Water drops like a guillotine. An unhealthy fog blankets the land, and upon seeing it, one fisherman tells a newspaper that it's the wrath of the fairies. I knew it by the signs they were coming. And perhaps he's not far off, because a tiny, malicious organism is riding the reins. The water washes fungus spores off the infected leaves, carrying it to the ground. And under the soil, the 1846 potato crop begins to decay. In January 1846, Daniel O'Connell had stood in Parliament and warned that Peel was not doing enough to fight the famine. "There are 5 million people on the verge of starvation," he warned. "And I'm speaking from the depth of my conviction when I say I believe the result of neglect will be death to an enormous amount." Now, 8 months later, Peel was gone, and the government was doing even less. Hunger began pulling Ireland apart. Mothers starved until their milk gave out and their babies died. Men who had survived on food depots and public work projects found succor in neither. Orders had been given to food depots to preserve their grain until December. It didn't matter. People arrived at the depots on foot, shoeless, having not eaten in days. Depots relented and passed out cornmeal, but their reserves were getting low. Gangs of men carrying shovels marched into market towns demanding work. Food availability was not the problem. Amid the famine, bread sat in shop windows, and Irish merchants exported tons of beef, grain, and oats to England. The government refused to intervene, so across the island, starving peasants did instead. In County Waterford, an armed militia blocked 2 barges that were transporting Irish grain for export. That done, they moved into the town, beating merchants, stealing bread, and lighting buildings afire. A unit of dragoons ordered them to disperse. When they didn't, the soldiers opened fire. 6 bodies lay in the street. Yet as Ireland reeled towards famine, in London, Sir Charles Trevelyan was retooling his relief plan to be less generous. Trevelyan was a legend in the civil service, incorruptible, pious, and hardworking. But he was also a workaholic micromanager, steeped in the Victorian belief that poverty was the sign of moral failure. To Trevelyan, the Irish problem, the fact that Ireland remained trapped in a cycle of poverty, violence, and rebellion, lay in the Irish character. They were lazy, rebellious, and took no initiative, he thought. Potato cultivation was too easy, only requiring a few months' labor a year, breeding idleness. And it was prone to failure. And when it failed, the Irish turned to government to feed them. Absent or neglectful Irish landowners shouldered little of the cost. And London feared that the Irish were becoming habitually dependent on government aid. To save Ireland, he thought, it needed modernization and agricultural reform. He dreamed of an anglicized Ireland, like the one that existed in its cities and market towns, one with English-style capitalism and a market economy, like theirs, to serve as a trade partner. He wanted to sweep out Ireland's communal village life and barter system, replacing it with a workforce that worked for wages rather than potatoes. One where they earned money to buy food. Trevelyan saw this flight not as a disaster, but a God-sent opportunity to remake Irish society. And he was determined to make the most of it, no matter how much suffering he had to endure. Great guy. In fact, Trevelyan had studied under the economist Malthus, who argued that when a population outstripped food production, starvation and death was a natural and proper correction. When Malthus put forth the theory, he was thinking of Ireland, and Trevelyan agreed. That belief in Malthusian principles, alongside a commitment to non-intervention in the free market, would plunge Ireland deep into famine. So when Trevelyan rolled out his reformed relief plan, it was no surprise that its primary mission was not to feed the starving, but instead to protect the free market, prevent abuse, and teach economic lessons. When food depots reopened, the poor found that the cornmeal was no longer sold at cost. That, argued Trevelyan, undercut local merchants. Now it was market price. All food depots would close, except those in the West. And Trevelyan insisted that any maize purchased come from British merchants, not American ones. When the public works began again, job seekers discovered their new wages were based on performance rather than a flat daily fee, and even the highest wages couldn't feed a family. The wages themselves were supposedly funded via a tax on Irish landlords, but many landlords had little to spare, and due to multiple levels of bureaucracy, and to prevent fraud, the road crew's wages often took weeks to arrive. And finally, there would be no intervention in food prices. Laissez-faire economics would rule. High prices, Trevelyan argued, would attract food imports. But, you guessed it, they didn't. In fact, food prices had soared higher than ever. It had been a bad year for agriculture, and not just in Ireland. Crops failed across Europe. Countries scrambled to import extra food, and Trevelyan was late to refill his corn. So by the time he grudgingly started looking, there was little to be had. And in Ireland, potato and cornmeal prices doubled. At government food depots, hungry people arrived from miles away, only to find the maize unaffordable. Across the island, small farmers and landless agricultural workers were plunged into immediate destitution. They surged into market towns to beg for food at depots, and they even began entering the hated workhouses, a government poor relief program best described as a prison for the poor, where they lived while performing mindless work in exchange for 2 meals a day. And workhouses were abusive and inhumane by design, so the poor would only enter as a last resort. Yet even they were over capacity. Despite the people's desperation, landlords upped the eviction, calling in police and soldiers to throw families out and demolish their homes with the sledgehammer and crowbar. Tenants killed livestock in retribution, and on occasion ambushed and murdered landlords. Evicted families wandered the roads, pitching tents in ditches. Crime rates doubled. This was the season of the gun. And it wasn't just the small tenant farmers and landless laborers showing up at the food depots. Managers reported small
Surrender now!
10 to 15-acre men approaching them to request aid, iron bows hanging off their skeletal frames. One had even walked 12 miles to an unfamiliar town rather than listen to his neighbors that he'd gone bankrupt. Blight compounded everything. In small farms, barley rotted in the field. Usually farmers paid laborers to harvest, but they had neither money nor potatoes to offer. And as if that wasn't enough, that winter, a series of blizzards ravaged the island, snow stacking to the rooftops, entombing whole villages. Soon, the new year dawned on what would be known as Black 47. January brought a strange frenzy. Families, hollow-eyed and losing hair, stumbled to the shore with seaweed and oysters. They scaled 300-foot cliffs just to steal bird eggs. They could have survived off fish, but they had neither the equipment, boats, nor skill for deep water fishing. And by that time, most of the fishermen had pawned their nets for cornmeal. Armed gangs ambushed government food convoys and butchered stolen cattle to survive. By the end of January, 700,000 had turned to working on public works. These famine roads were often a waste. They started nowhere and went nowhere. Malnourished work gangs broke rocks in freezing temperatures. Their shoes and coats long ago lost to the pawn shop. And they died there, in great numbers, collapsing beside the road from exhaustion. Violence against public works managers became so pervasive that many deserted their posts, while others, laden with guilt, ended their own lives. In a famine, it's not the starvation that kills you, it's the diseases that follow. Typhus, dysentery, fever, and the famine dropsy. Peasants fleeing the countryside carried them into cities, and infection ran so rampant in workhouses, the staff began to quit. Visitors and officials reported seeing villages where the want was so extreme that families lacked the energy to even bury their dead. The Irish funeral, so embodied in the culture, disappeared piece by piece. No one wanted to gather for fear of the fevers. None could afford a coffin, and eventually, even individual graves were dispensed with. Dogs scattered burial fields. Amid that landscape of horror, one place stood out as particularly destitute. Skibbereen, in County Cork, became internationally famous for its deplorable conditions. Drought exacerbated the famine, and after a few months, the frantic scramble to survive had passed, leaving only a lethargic weight on the grave. Families crawled across their cabins, too weak to even walk, and to visiting Americans had a surreal conversation with two young women as they casually calculated how many days they had left to live. 14, they agreed. Accounts from Skibbereen made the village internationally famous, the face of the Great Hunger, and its ghoulish tales, repeated in newspapers, inspired people around the globe to raise money for famine relief. Donations came from as far away as Australia, and in the United States, even enslaved people and Native Americans raised funds for Ireland. The international outcry finally pushed the family to act. For months, he downplayed the increasingly urgent and alarming reports from his own officers on the ground, even when they rebelled against his policies. selling formula cops, or serving food stores and workhouses.
You weirdo!
The British government would support outdoor living, the opening of soup kitchens, and food meal distribution. But it was too little, too late. Deep famine had already affected the planting season, and the next crop would be corn. Many Irish decided they only had two options: either fight for Ireland or leave it. Fiddles and songs carry out the war of the house as neighbors sit inside to pay their respects. It's a wait from two sisters, girls the town has known their whole lives will never go on to be among them. The neighbors approach the girls, shake their hands, and kiss. For these girls are still alive. Yet by tomorrow, they may as well be in their graves. They've saved enough for the Atlantic Passage, and tomorrow will
Take
leave
them
the
down.
town that until now made up their whole world. This goodbye party is what's known as an American. Their mother cradles them, sobbing, knowing that when they disappear down the bend, she'll never again see them. In a time before photographs and telephones, she will have nothing of them, except perhaps a lock of hair and a fading scent on empty bedsheets. But still, they must go. Irish immigration became a fact of life over a century before the Great Famine. But amid the horrors of 1847, it reached a fever pitch. That year, a stunning 240,000 out of a population of 8 million left in search of a new life, where they could escape the hunger, disease, poverty, and surging violence. 1847 would prove the worst year of the famine. The British government had stepped up food aid, and private charities had tried to fill the need, but it was too late. Disease had taken hold, the economy collapsed, and the cities filled with starving refugees coalescing around food distribution hubs. The old bonds of Irish life, the family and communal village, were tearing apart as people sought a way out, even if it meant parting with those they loved. Irish living abroad in Canada, Australia, Britain, and the United States urged their families to come join them. Travel books began appearing in Dublin, laying out the different areas of Canada, where to settle, and how to get there. And people went. But the people who left were, by and large, not those suffering the worst of the famine. Ship passage across the Atlantic was expensive, and prices could fluctuate every hour. Generally, a ticket to the United States cost about £5, while passage to Canada cost $3. These were high sums, completely unattainable for those economically ruined or working for sustenance on the famine roads. Therefore, it was not the poorest who immigrated, but rather those who still had some means. Small farmers who could sell land and equipment, for example. Immigrants tended to come from communities that were hard hit by the famine, but not so desolated as Skibbereen or other areas in the West. There were, of course, other ways. Some landlords considered voluntary immigration the cheapest and most humane way to clear their land. One that, as a bonus, wouldn't put them under the threat of assassination in retaliation for evictions. They offered to pay a certain number of tenants to sail to Canada and found themselves inundated with applications. The truly desperate, though, found an innovative solution. They would commit a crime in front of a police officer, hoping that the sentencing judge would transport them to Australia. Actually, when a sympathetic judge moved to acquit a pair of women after one of these crimes, they just threatened to simply walk out of the courthouse and do it again. So, they got what they wanted: 7 years at a penal colony in Tasmania. But even for those lucky enough to get to a point, the danger wasn't past. Dockside conmen fleeced the new arrivals, charging huge commissions for buying tickets or provisions. Some sold expired tickets, or provided ludicrous currency exchange rates. And then, a ship's departure might even be delayed, forcing prospective travelers to rent rooms they couldn't afford. As a result, many who made it to the port of Liverpool found themselves unable to afford passage and melted into the city's underclass. And all of this for space on a ship not meant to carry passengers. For the ships that plied the routes from Canada to Ireland were actually cargo vessels. They'd arrived in Cork or Liverpool, discharged their homes full of timber, and were hastily refit to carry Irish immigrants on their voice. And outdated British passenger laws mandated only 10 feet of space per passenger and 7 pounds of bread per week. The government knew these deficiencies were dangerous, but they wanted to encourage settlers. Tighter regulations would raise ticket prices, making Canada less attractive in comparison with the United States. The vessels on the Canada route quickly gained a dark nickname: coffin ships. The diseases festering in Ireland hitchhiked aboard, ravaging the passengers in the unventilated decks. Ship's crews, fearing disease, might keep the passengers as virtual prisoners below decks, and even refuse to collect the dead. One ship, the Agnes, left Liverpool with 427 Irish passengers. It arrived in Quebec with 150. That was extreme. But in the 1847 sailing season, it was not unusual for between 15 and 20% of Irish immigrants to die during the crossing. Those that survived languished on quarantine islands, unable to set foot ashore while the disease spread further in the tent city. Conditions were so bad that the Bishop of Quebec sent a letter to the Catholic Church in Ireland begging them to preach against immigration. Yet, they came anyway, and they made it. Thousands of Irish settled in Canada, with others walking south towards the border and crossing into the United States. Down the East Coast, things were no better, despite the higher ticket prices. It had taken many Irish refugees all they had in order to afford passage to the United States, and few had the funds to move inland once they reached a port. So people who had dreamt of farming in the West ended up clustering in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. And though generations of Irish immigrants had arrived before the so-called famine Irish, the newly arrived often found that their predecessors did not welcome them. Those earlier waves of immigrants skewed wealthier and Protestant, and old sectarian tensions continued to simmer in the New World. Canadian cities in particular were known for brawls and riots around sensitive dates, like St. Patrick's Day and the anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. And in both Canada and the United States, Irish immigrants, mostly Protestant, began referring to themselves as Ulster or Scots to differentiate themselves from the new underclass. In America, nativist societies sprang up, pressuring the government to cut immigration and contain the new Irish immigrants that they considered both racially inferior and religiously subversive. A fringe political organization called the American Party, widely known as the Know Nothing movement, arose to oppose immigration. And spinning conspiracy theories about Catholic plots to take over the United States, nativist groups formed criminal gangs like the Bowery Boys that harassed immigrants.
Alright, squad, we're moving on!
Measured the heads and faces of the incoming Irish, using pseudoscience to declare them racially inferior. Newspapers breathlessly reported on the crime, hopelessness, and squalor of New York's largely Irish-American Five Points neighborhood, making it America's most famous slum. And the Five Points was horrible. Stately hotels became crowded tenements, their hall floors sitting unclean for so long that trash hardened and became part of the floor. In the 1850s, 55% of arrests in New York were Irish, and Irish women made up a quarter of the city's sex workers. Irish gangs like the Dead Rabbit clashed with the nativist groups like the Bowery Boys. In 1849, a dispute during a performance of Macbeth caused the state militia to open fire on the town, killing around 30 people. And in 1857, the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys fought a citywide gang war that raged for 2 days. But recently, historians have found another side to the infamous Five Points. A new study of records at a New York immigrant bank discovered that a sizable number of residents had 6 months to a year's worth of salary savings, a rainy day fund to get them through a crisis. Therefore, it appears that some stayed in the Five Points not because there was no other option, but because the cheap housing allowed them to save more, send money home to family, and stay a part of an Irish community. And crucially, in New York, the Irish had a champion that would fight for them. John Joseph Hughes had been born in Ulster and found his calling in the church. Not particularly spiritual, but aware of the political power the church wielded, Hughes used his position as bishop and later Archbishop of New York to protect Irish immigrants and culture. In New York, Hughes saw a chance to rebuild Irish Catholicism, which was in ruins after centuries of religious oppression at home. And he began using the First Amendment as a cudgel, demolishing architectural laws that forced Catholic churches to look like Protestant ones, and argued against the Protestant King James Bible in schools. He founded Irish Catholic schools and newspapers, and during and after Mass, he ran classes on how to assimilate to American culture. And when he had to, he played rough. In 1844, a nativist rally in Philadelphia turned into a riot. with nativists flooding out to beat immigrants and burn Catholic churches. Shortly afterward, the nativists scheduled a rally in New York. Hughes visited the mayor and delivered a clear message. If one Catholic church was touched, the Irish were prepared to burn New York to the ground. The mayor canceled the rally. Other Irish moved west, into the coal mines of Pennsylvania and the gold fields of California. They worked construction, digging canals and laying railroad tracks, gaining a reputation for doing hard work well, finding their place in these new lands. And they kept coming, because in Ireland, light had returned. The country they escaped would not see a full potato harvest until 1849. Dublin, August 5th, 1847. The city awakens to the toll of cathedral bells.
Dubliners from every level of society, from shoeless boys to princes of the church,
Course through the streets, walking toward St. Mary. Men sent as representatives from the furthest towns of Ireland had their pockets, ensuring they have matches to light a votive. They're all going to see a man buried, and not just any man. 3 days before, in a year when so many had died without cause, thousands of people had watched blood be carried through the streets. Inside was the liberator, Daniel Oakes. Their religious freedom, the first Irish Catholic to sit in Parliament, and the man who had come closer than anyone to refute the act of union tying Ireland to Great Britain, a crusader who had denounced anti-Semitism and slavery, and a man who in death had their forgiveness, for in their greatest hour of need, he had failed them. In 1847, the British government changed on its policy of trying to morally reform Ireland via food aid. The Prime Minister, Lord John Russell, recognized the failure of Trevelyan's aid program and turned to directly feeding 3 million in Ireland via soup kitchens and workhouses. Private charities joined in with Irish Quakers trying to fill the gap. Donations to the British Relief Association came from as far away as India, Mexico, and Venezuela. Queen Victoria sent public letters asking the British to donate to relief organizations and contributed £2,000. And large donations came from Pope Pius IX and the Sultan of Turkey, who had also sent ships full of supplies. It was not enough, but it did save many lives. The 1847 harvest was a healthy one, with no signs of blight, yet it was only a quarter the size of a normal harvest. Desperate farmers had eaten their seed potatoes in 1846, leaving few to plant for next year's crop. So though free of blight, Ireland still needed aid. But British relief started to run into popular opposition. Homeless Irish refugees were increasingly showing up in British cities, stranded while trying to make it to a point. And a bubble in railroad construction had recently burst, sending Britain into recession. And so, a public view of Ireland with deep prejudice but some sympathy began to sour. The British press portrayed the Irish as freemen. Aid was scaled back and began to